Hello, welcome to the first in a series of episodes where we'll be doing a deep dive into the wonderful world of company registers. I'm Steve Lamb, and over the last 5 years, I've been immersed in the twin worlds of business verification and anti-money laundering. Over that time, I've learned just how useful company registers can be to businesses, journalists, the public, and crucially, those tasked with combating financial crime. But that's only half the story. Company registers can also be hard to access, difficult to navigate, and have varying registration rules depending on the country. In the course of my work with Kyckr, I've come to see just how different they can be. And while I'm also often asked, can you really rely on them for accurate information? To help answer these questions and more, over the next few months, the Kyckr team will be releasing a series of guides which cover registers across some of the world's biggest financial centres. We'll also be producing accompanying video podcasts featuring the expert opinion of someone with deep knowledge of the local registry. And on that note, we're kicking off today with a discussion about the UK's Companies House. And I'm delighted to be joined by Barrow, host of the Dark Money Files podcast and director of Risk Alert 24/7. For those familiar with his work, Graham will no doubt need no introduction. But if you're not from the UK, Graham is a banking veteran whose financial crime expertise has been put excellently to use advising across both the private and public sectors. A regular media commentator, Graham's also well known for his LinkedIn and X posts, which expose, sometimes to humorous effect, some of the stranger business registrations, shall we say, that are at Companies House. It was also Graham's birthday yesterday. So Graham, I obviously have to start by asking, is there any better present than getting to spend the morning talking about Companies House?
No, I mean, it's the pinnacle of my life's work talking about companies. I mean, I've got so far down the route of birthdays, I'm just glad to still be alive, frankly, Steve, so it's all good.
Well, it's also an interesting day, Graham and I were just saying, because it's the launch of the Strategic Intelligence Assessment for Companies House. So we've got lots to talk about anyway, and then some very topical news, I think, which will shape our discussion as well. But maybe as a starting point, Graham, I think many of our listeners will be working in financial crime and wondering how they can improve their business verification efforts. So just to set the scene, how effective do you think Companies House is as a tool for AML analysts?
Well, I think I'm going to split that into two elements, if you don't mind, Steve. One is in terms of accessing and using the platform. And it's actually very good. It is an incredibly stable platform. The search functions, once you kind of get some of the quirks sorted out, are pretty decent. It has very little downtime. Response time is quick. So from that point of view, very good. In terms of what you extract from it, not so good. I want to preface what I'm about to say by saying that overwhelmingly, the 800,000 or so companies formed every year are formed by legitimate businesses who provide the correct information. Sadly, that information is never verified at the moment by Companies House, so you don't actually know for certain it's okay. And of course, there is a smaller minority of people who completely abuse that process because they have no intention of running a legitimate commercial business, and there's no way of telling the difference between the two at the moment because none of the information is verified.
Yeah, I think that definitely rings true that there's almost in the UK this perception and then the reality when it comes to the National Register. I have people say to me all the time, Companies House, like you said, it's very easy to access. There's APIs available. You can get bulk data if you're working in a technology-related AML role. But that kind of hides, maybe some sins that appear under the surface. Because, as you said, on the one hand, it's great having open data and being able to access it, but you've really got to rely and trust what you're taking. So I think, on the availability piece, it's probably a tick. I'd say from our side, barring some of the ability to perhaps to get ownership data and dig into that, and not quite as accessible as some of the company data. But yeah, I think the common question we get, and something I'm really keen to dig into, is actually what can you rely on, and what is the level of scrutiny that's applied to that data?
Yeah,
I wonder if you could maybe touch on, Graham, as well. In your experience, what the difference is between the company data that exists at the register and the UBO data or the persons of significant control, as we'd call it.
Yeah, it's a really good point. So first, I think it's worth saying that through Companies House itself, you cannot search for persons with significant control, PSCs for short, directly. So there is no search function for PSCs in the same way that there is for directors. And I guess that's because they are technically not a legal, person in terms of their association with the company. They're an owner. Having said that, probably something over 90% of all PSCs are also directors. So there is a correlation. But you do tend to have, some sort of third-party software to get PSC data, which is a shame in a way, because it is really important, particularly if you've got, I don't know, a sanctioned individual sitting in the PSC population. So that's a problem. And I think an associated one is also the way that they store addresses. So there's a different technique to extracting a director's correspondence address from the way you might extract a company's registered address. So it has its quirks.
And I guess another quirk of the PSC register is simply the fact that it's publicly available. Because, we've seen since 2022 in particular, and the CJEU judgment in Europe, a gradual reduction of public access to UBO information, at least in Europe. I guess one of the striking features is that the fact that it is, publicly available and it can still be queried.
Yeah. Yes, except, one of the flaws again with Companies House is it doesn't actually do any validation of there's a form called an IN01. You probably know that, but maybe not so many people do, which is the incorporation document. Now, that includes your PSC declaration. It also includes your shareholder declaration. I can't tell you how often I've seen companies that have got a single 100% shareholder and then said, but we haven't got a PSC. Well, yes, you have, because one of the defining elements of the PSC is anyone who owns more than 25%. But that's not policed. So if you say on the form, we haven't got a PSC, it will go on the platform as this company doesn't have a PSC. So it's kind of, you have to take it like so much of that information, as a part of the picture. I'm not going to say with a pinch of salt, part of the picture, but on its own, it doesn't tell you anything wholly worthwhile about a potential or actual client.
I've certainly seen a huge amount of stories. Many of them you've been instrumental in bringing to public attention about the failings in the PSC data and what's been filed and it not meeting the definition of a UBO. I'll never forget there was a private eye investigation in the middle of the pandemic where they were looking at those had committed pandemic loan fraud and effectively trying to find out who owned these companies. And most of them they found actually had US lawyers registered as their UBOs.
I mean, I saw one yesterday, in fact, which was a private Singapore company registered as the PSC. Well, that doesn't meet anything close to the definition of what a PSC is. I get it that if you read the PSC definition document, it's not the most simple thing you'll ever read. But ultimately, a PSC is either a human being or a company which you can then, through publicly available information, establish is owned by other human beings. So ultimately, the PSC should always lead you to a natural person and never end up in a dead end of a corporate entity, because that wouldn't meet the definition. We're now working to get to a point where we have not just a transparent and easy to access register, but it's a verified one. I don't think it has to be one or the other. I think it can be both.
Well, that's a brilliant segue into one of the big issues, I think, at the moment when it comes to Companies House. And that is, given many of the issues you've exposed with data quality, whether the burden of data verification should sit with Companies House or should sit with the obliged entities that are onboarding businesses. What's your take on that?
Oh, I think it absolutely should sit with Companies House. I mean, you should not be accepting data at face value when the economic damage you can do with a limited liability company is extensive. And in fact, in a way, I've often thought, well, if creating a company is a precursor to accessing financial services, we'd do so much better if we actually got together and said, well, at the point of creating that company, why don't we do a really good job of verifying that information? And then it can act almost as a golden source for all of the downstream activity. And I think lots and lots of firms would be happy to contribute towards that effort, because you only have to do it once, rather than every time somebody applies to different banks for an account, they all do it individually. So I think we're missing a trick here. And I'm not going to say for a minute that would make it foolproof, because it clearly wouldn't. But if Companies House does at least as well as or better than any of the downstream banks would do if applied for an account with them, you only need to do it once.
Well, it's incredibly inefficient, isn't it? If I set a company and I'm setting up a bank account with Barclays and then setting up a Stripe account, so on, instructing a law firm, they're doing their verification every single time. You think about the amount of money and time that's being wasted just verifying the same information again.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have a government gateway account, so I can manage my tax affairs and all sorts of things on it. And part of that process is not just providing my ID, but actually it doesn't become enabled until they send me a code number to my address, which I then have to put in. That can still be got around, but it actually is a far more kind of robust process. So I think the government gateway idea would be a fantastic precursor to creating companies and all sorts of stuff. And also it would mean that every director who has multiple companies would only appear once on the register, because he would have to go through all of that specific details that you need to provide to get a government gateway.
You had a good example when we were talking of the research before this call, didn't you, of a director who I think you mentioned had multiple entries?
Yeah, she's created about, I won't name her, just, because I don't want a lawsuit. But she's created, or at least 3,000 companies, I think. And every single time she creates it, in order to create a company, you create what's called a corporate government gateway account. She's created a new corporate government gateway account, which means she has a different officer ID, which means every single one of those 3,000 companies is disaggregated on the register. The fact that multiple directorships of active companies is identified as a vulnerability, because you can't actually be an active director of 800 or 900 companies at the same time, because all you'd ever do would be go to board meetings. So, and Companies House is very clear, and the Companies Act says that a company director has legal responsibility for the company. You can't just be a proxy. It's not how it works. So aggregating that data would very quickly point in the direction of people who clearly cannot be proper, directors of a company. They are just a titular head or director.
So we've talked about the strategic intelligence threat assessment a couple of times over this call. And again, of course, it's very, very live. I'm sure most of our listeners won't have had a chance to read through it yet. What were some of the key points that came out of that for you?
The first thing was, it's a bit like reading everything I've ever done for the last 3 or 4 years, because for all sorts of reasons, I don't want to sound, big-headed here, but for all sorts of reasons, most of what they talked about were stories that in one way or another I have been involved in. I'm not going to say I'm the only person that knew about this stuff, but there were a couple. One of them was really marked, was there was this huge increase in applications to remove names from register because they've been used fraudulently, which Companies House said might in part have been driven by 2 significant data leaks. And I worked on those 2 data leaks. I actually worked with the lawyers who were acting on behalf of the firms whose data had been leaked. Sadly, Companies House said 1,020. It was much more than that. But also, I know the human cost behind those data leaks. I know some of the individual stories of people whose data was stolen and used to create these companies, and they are quite harrowing. So I think, one of the things when I read that is it can come across quite dry, but actually underneath it, there are it's a bit like, romance fraud and APP and all these others. It's easy to forget the real stories of the people who suffer because of these things. And I think when we do our jobs, and obviously you provide a really important service to firms doing that properly, just remember, it's not just to tick a box for the regulator. It's because we're trying to stop ordinary human beings' lives being made a misery by the actions of organised criminal networks.
Absolutely. I mean, you have to constantly remember that, don't you? The human side to it. And, what we always say to our team and our customers is that, if we're talking about money laundering, well, why is money laundered? Well, usually not for good reasons, right? It's because they're looking to do something criminal, and criminality inevitably has a human cost to it.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you can't launder clean money.
I think that is a good thing to understand. But like you said as well, it definitely gone under the radar, at least for those that aren't familiar with your own work, about this use of personal data to set up fraudulent companies, and actually the impact that had. It has been very, very difficult to get those removed.
It has, and it's it's also worth pointing out there are a number of routes by which that data can be used, and sometimes it is, and the threat report points this out. It can be vulnerable people who are either coerced or paid to allow their details to be used. It can be hacked or leaked data that's being used, or it can be, they call them company tourists. They're people who are just brought into the company to provide some details, and then they get a paid holiday in the UK for their, for the pleasure. There's a whole variety of reasons why what ends up on the register isn't actually the people who will be running the company. I think there are also, if you organise your data well, there are a whole load of ways of identifying that is a likely probability, and therefore this company should be put on some sort of alert because it's exhibiting signs of not being a normal commercial entity.
Mm. So we've talked a lot about then the failings of Companies House, obviously, and some of the ones that they themselves have recognised in this new assessment. What's your hope for the future? What do you think is possible in terms of where we might get to as improvements?
Because of the invasion of Ukraine, it has changed the whole momentum for change in the UK and forced the government to recognise that Companies House was a really significant vulnerability in the ability to avoid sanctions or evade sanctions, as well as global corruption and money laundering. So I think there is huge momentum to reform Companies House and to put it in a better place. Because it's taken 180 years to get here, it isn't going to be quick. And I think even the current reform program is going to take at least 3 years to implement. There are 5 or 6 million companies on Companies House. There are 8 million directors. You cannot verify all that stuff overnight. And I think you and I might have a view on how many of those 8 million directors will actually provide verification. Because I suspect it may not even be half. I mean, I genuinely think that there will be a massive removal of director details for failing to verify for a whole range of reasons. But I think we are hopefully moving towards a better place. One of the really interesting statistics that Companies House provided in that report was the UK registers 150% more companies than the next most incorporated jurisdiction, which is Australia. Actually, in hard terms, it's hundreds of thousands of more, but by population, it's about 150% more than Australia. And we are in a league of our own for company incorporations. Now, you're just going to have to accept that a lot of that is through organised criminal activity because we're such a good place to be. And my hope is, over the next few years, we will see a regularisation of those numbers that brings us kind of more back in line with other countries. So it is about economic activity and not criminal activity. But I'm kind of, having just had a birthday, hoping I live long enough to see it now.
Well, it's a tough, political spot, isn't it? I guess for the current government as well, because again, those of you that aren't in the UK or not broadly aware of UK politics, growth is the big story at the moment in the UK. How we get the economic engine firing, and I think there's a careful balancing point there, isn't there, between how you make it easy to set up companies and removing friction there, but also reducing crime. And, sadly, the UK is getting a reputation as a hub for financial crime.
It is. And again, the report points out that actually amongst the developed economies, if we exclude places like Rwanda and Venezuela, where it's actually free to incorporate, but in the developed economies, we are by far and away the cheapest. And even, £50 is significantly lower than most other developed economies in terms of the cost of incorporation. So I think we've got a way to go. I think, your point about economic growth is an important one, but actually I'm not sure the correlation between incorporations and economic growth is proven anyway. So I think, we should have that conversation.
Funny, isn't it? As always, and on lots of fronts with our customers at the moment, it comes back to there's probably an optimum amount of friction. You don't want too much friction, but you don't want no friction. You need that, certainly that kind of verification step, that human in the loop to assure things are being captured.
Yeah, and I think it's quite interesting. Sorry to jump in, but it's quite interesting that the banks have been selling this friction-free payment method for years. And the minute we've introduced automatic refunds for APP fraud, they've decided that a bit of friction in the process is probably the worst thing, because actually that's better than then having to be coughing up half of the cost of the fraud to the person who's been defrauded. So I think the friction argument is only there when there's no cost involved to the banks of providing it. The minute it becomes a cost, I think that they will decide that a bit of friction, and I think this is also true of Companies House, a little bit of friction isn't the worst thing in the world if it ultimately saves a lot of downstream expense and effort.
Amazing. Okay, so we've kind of mapped out a picture then of, some problems at the moment. They're quite clear, maybe a route forward, in terms of how the situation can improve. If we're speaking to AML analysts that are sat there right now having to deal with Companies House and the variety of other sources they might need to do their jobs, what would be your top tips for verifying businesses in the UK?
Well, I think it's some fairly straightforward ones, like, have they got an online presence? It's amazing. I mean, I've looked at companies that have got accounts that, putting forward the fact that they're turning over hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds. And yet I can't find any sight of them on the internet. So I think there's some easy ones, like, is there an internet presence? Do the directors or the addresses of that company share, their duties or their addresses with lots of other companies? I will know that there are a few addresses, mainly in central London, which are home to hundreds of thousands of companies, literally in one case. So there's lots of good reasons for using those addresses, but it's about, interrogating the data. I mean, is it a real address? I mean, sadly, you can actually register a completely fictitious address. So I think there's some straightforward things that you can do. The other thing I would always think about, and you'd need access to a data aggregator, a bit like does this company or do the directors have any global connections? Mm. So one of the things I'm always interested in is if I find a director who also is director of companies, let's just say of Cyprus and Panama, that would be a red flag to me, because those two jurisdictions sadly are home to, quite a number of also suspicious entities. So is there a global element to your ownership and control structure? And if so, are they in the sorts of jurisdictions that you're comfortable them being in?
Mm. Oh, I think that's so important. Like you said, to take that global view. The amount of times we see companies or directors who are involved in multiple jurisdictions, and that's not necessarily captured at that initial step.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can be complicated by the fact that some of those jurisdictions don't use Western script. So when you have Greek or Cyrillic or Arabic, doing those matches can be quite tricky. So, I mean, it's not a trivial task. And of course, people who have bad intentions are very adept at using those differences in order to hide their ownership and control networks.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up the discussion. That we are battling again against criminals, aren't we? And sadly they are innovative and they know how to exploit the loopholes. I think that the good thing, and particularly in the UK, is we've now got government impetus behind this. The issues have been exposed again thanks to your good work and others, and also there's the private sector, right? So businesses like Kyckr, like Risk Alert 24/7. All developing some quite innovative solutions to counter this problem.
No, absolutely. And I know you haven't asked me to do this, but just to plug your ongoing series, understanding how different registers around the world works isn't just a nice thing to know. It is exactly contextualizing what we've just said. If you don't understand how they work, you may well be missing a trick in terms of bad actors who are using one or more of those other registers, as well as the UK, and understanding how to map across them. Really important part of anyone who deals with global business.
Mm. Excellent. Well, yes, I hope it can be helpful, definitely. So, Graham, I want to thank you for your time and your insights. I'm sure everybody will find those really useful. And yes, we'll be back shortly looking at another registry. Thank you.
Thank you.